Hi, my name is Shubha Bala, and I'm the Director of Technology at the Center for Coordination. And I'm here with Emma Vendervest, who's a project manager and technology strategist at the Center for Coordination as well. The Center for Coordination is a nonprofit based in New York City, and we operate programs on the ground in New York, New Jersey, and we work with jurisdictions all across the United States and the world who are looking to make justice reforms in their work. We're here today to talk about a really specific use of technology in a recent project that we launched. And it is basically to engage court participants or participants through e-learning or digital learning. And so for this presentation, we're going to talk about the project and also our unique and innovative approach that was very community minded. So, sort of where we were coming from is imagine you're homeless, you live in New York City, and you have to use the bathroom. And maybe pre COVID, you would go to a friend's apartment, maybe go to the library, a local community center. But hey, now everything's closed. You've got no choice. So you find somewhere tucked out of the way and you take a pee. And unfortunately, the police see you and they give you a ticket. This ticket is for $75 for public urination, and you don't even have money for the subway. So you definitely don't have money to pay this $75 fine. So you decide you're going to go in and fight it because, after all, these are very exceptional circumstances. Generally not been in trouble with the law. You scrounge together the money, get on the subway, and make an hour and a half trek to get to this one government office. And you think in your mind, you know what the government is like. You are prepared to be incredibly confused, have all this legal jargon thrown at you. You're prepared to argue, you're prepared to yell, and you're prepared to be ignored despite doing all of that. So you finally get in, you do get a hearing, but in the hearing, it's rejected. So you still have a ticket, and there's no way you can afford this $75. You're told that if you wanted to, you could come back again next week to take a group class if you cannot pay the fine. But it was hard enough to get here in the first place. It costs like almost $5 to take the subway back and forth. So you feel frustrated, annoyed, and hopeless. You figure, well, you can't pay the fine and you're just going to have to deal with whatever the consequences are. You're not even sure what the consequences are, but you figure maybe it'll be a warrant or, an additional fine or whatever, but you've really got no choice. So our project was to attempt to deal with situations like this and understandably how people might feel in this moment. So this was CCI with the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings in New York City. And so we decided to create this digital experience for someone to do instead of paying this fine. And we think that our digital experience was really unique. There are some other things out there. But in our case, we, as an organization that works a lot with members of the community, we decided that rather than focusing on accountability, we would focus on procedural justice and changing someone's perception of the system. The first phase of this project began in 2018, and it was so successful that we launched a second phase, which actually last month is now live, and people can do the second phase anywhere online instead of paying a fine. So we'll discuss that. So what we're going to be talking about in this hour is first, we're going to give you a bit of background. What is the Criminal Justice Reform Act that led to this? Then we're going to talk about digital learning and how it links to procedural justice. And then if some of you are interested in implementing this, our last section will be really getting into how we planned it and some of the very specific details. And then lastly, how we set about design. So we'll get into some details down to the nitty gritty of costs and trade-offs that we made as we approached this e-learning. So to start out with and give you some background on the Criminal Justice Reform Act, In 2017, New York City's Criminal Justice Reform Act shifted many of our low-level violations from criminal charges to civil charges. When that happened, Civil Alternatives was established in partnership with the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice and OATH, the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings, so that we could also provide meaningful options for those who cannot pay or choose not to pay a fine. The program works to support safer neighborhoods, reduce arrests, and lessen the impact of low-level criminal enforcement. So previously, most of these summons were handled in criminal court, which of course exposed defendants to the possibility of a permanent criminal record or even a jail stay for infractions like public drinking or public urination or even breaking park rules. So the idea here was that we would also offer people the option to perform, again, meaningful community service. And what are some of the common violations, just to give you an idea? Some examples include public consumption of alcohol, public urination, unauthorized presence in the park after dark, littering or spitting, or unlawful vending. So when you get these tickets, you have the option to pay your fine online or in person to any of the 5 boroughs. You have the option to come in person for a hearing and, of course, dispute the ticket. And then if you're in violation, if you are found still in violation and you either don't want to or can't pay the fine, CCI was brought in to offer service. And so the digital learning that we're going to describe for the rest of this presentation is one of the options for someone who can't afford a fine. There are, at least pre-COVID, there are other options as well, depending on the individual, their needs, and the amount of the fine. So for example, if someone's fine is over $75, you would have to do more hours, like you would have to do 2 hours, for example. And so what is important, this will come up later, is that the statute or whatever, the way that this is written is really that the cost of the fine tells you how long you must engage in community service for. So some other options include individual counseling, a session on civic engagement. So this would be a group class that you could do. These are all in person. There would be on-site community service. And so I believe at the moment that looks like fairly traditional community service, be it picking up garbage or painting or that sort of thing. And then again, this digital module I'll describe. So even when we designed, even when the CJRA whole act was being designed and thought through and figuring out things like how much, what kind of community service, etc. Our team at CCI immediately thought, I think that there could be some advantages to offering something digital in the mix. And so we knew there were some pretty obvious benefits to doing something digital. One is that it's implementable in multiple languages. So of course, New York City, we have a lot of people with different languages that come in for these types of services. And so usually we would be hiring a translator or phone translator if we don't have that language capability on staff. So the great thing with something digital is it's much more cost effective to offer in multiple languages and doesn't require someone having and then it avoids the wait for having a group class, for example. You come in at 9 a.m., you realize that there's a group class at 4 p.m. or the next day or a week later. Maybe you decide that individual counseling makes sense, but you have to wait for that. So with the advantage, of course, of something digital is you usually start at the moment. And it can help cater to different learning styles, where for some people, group class might be good, or a one-on-one verbal sort of conversation might be great. For some people, it might be better to have that sort of private digital space to go. And then it can be cost effective, of course. If this works really well, then that can be a more cost effective option. But we also knew that there were trade-offs. So, one thing that you can get when you have something in person, of course, is the ability to offer very specific resources based on a conversation you're having with somebody. And with the digital module, as you'll see, we do offer resources, but it can't be catered, of course. And there can be benefits for many people to group sessions. You might connect with other people who are having similar experiences to you. And as we get into the procedural justice bit, we'll talk a bit about voice and the importance of voice, and we'll talk about how difficult that can be through our digital e-learning. Great. So when we set out to create our e-learning, so we now have decided we think e-learning will be a great option, and we went through a sort of traditional RFP process. We put out a call for vendors, and we quickly realized we needed to understand what our goal of the e-learning was. So when someone walked out of that room or they stepped away from their computer, how do we know that this was successful? And as we started our quest to understand the world of e-learning, we realized that with many vendors, that it's often about how much somebody learned. So at the end, maybe you have a quiz, and did someone get 50% or more on the quiz? Then it's successful. But in our case, the weird thing was that according to this law, it really was just about the time that they spent. Whether they learned something or not, as long as they sat there for an hour, they have met their requirement. They could have learned nothing whatsoever. So that is not a very inspiring way to approach, a digital learning module. So we spent some time talking to our facilitators of the classes that we currently do, these quality of life classes. And what we really heard from them is that what you are trying to have is someone walk out with maybe a more positive attitude, often walking in angry, frustrated, understandable feelings. And sort of the success would be that someone walked away feeling better than when they walked in, or at least having maybe a more positive attitude agency towards their interaction with the system than they would have expected. Not to say that they suddenly everything is great, but a slightly more. So the more we discuss this internally, the more we realize that what we were just describing procedural justice. Procedural justice is basically this common sense idea, but that's backed by rigorous research, that when court users perceive the justice system to be fair, they're more likely to comply and follow the law in the future. And the studies show that this is true regardless of what the actual outcome is. So the outcome could still be a negative outcome. But if they perceive that it happened in a fair manner, they will sort of feel better about it and have a more positive interaction next time. And so what this actually breaks down to is giving people an understanding, treating them with dignity and respect, ensuring that they have a voice and that they feel that decisions are being made neutrally and that they're being treated neutrally. So in designing our e-learning, we realized that from the sort of content perspective, so now we knew our goal was really around procedural justice. And so from the content perspective, we wanted to have 3 sections. One is helping them to understand the system, especially when now there are these changes from criminal to civil summons. And frankly, I didn't understand any of it until I did this project. So very confusing changes. And we wanted them to understand it for themselves, but also because they're going to be talking. So their understanding will help other people understand. The second is we did want them to have some accountability, or we required to have them have some accountability for these quality of life tickets. And so what we decided is maybe an understanding of why are these considered quality of life offenses? What is the actual impact on other people? And then the third is optionally for them to learn more about the resources and paths available to them in New York City, in housing and education and etc. So while that was the content, procedural justice really defined the experience we want to have. So now we'll talk about what procedural justice is and show you the e-learning a little bit and how we got to those things. So the first one, as I mentioned, is understanding. So people who feel like they understand the process are more likely to feel favorable about their experience. So, right, what is a civil summons and what is civil versus criminal and what is the impact? So I'm going to show you now some of the e-learning. Yes. Okay, so great. So here's an example where we are telling someone, what is the process that they just went through and how is a civil summons different than a criminal summons, which is what used to exist. So one thing you'll notice as we go through this is that some of this moves pretty slowly. And this is the part where, because we required people to spend a full hour, we didn't want someone to just be clicking through the whole thing and then be done in 5 minutes. So you'll see that this sort of moves at the pace that it was coded. Here it's asked you to click on the option that you think applies to civil summonses. So civil summonses cannot result in an open. So we do that, and then it will say correct. What applies to civil summons? So we could do cannot contest online. That's not true, so it'll say that is incorrect. Must be heard at a designated criminal courthouse. Right, and that one is also incorrect. So that's just an example of an interaction that allowed for some understanding. And then I'm just going to show you one more. So this is sort of trying to get a little bit at understanding just what the law even is, right? I mean, what is legal and what's not legal. And so here we have these interactive scenes where you can click on people and it will teach you something about whether something's illegal or not. So it's illegal to drink on sidewalks and streets, but you can drink in designated outdoor seating areas. And then here's a park scene. So, it tells you about alcohol in unlabeled containers is also illegal. Here we have one on biking on pedestrian paths in parks is illegal. And smoking is also illegal in city parks and beaches. So as you click through, you learn a little bit more about what is legal and what is not. So I will go back to the slides now. So we went through the process, we went through the why, what is the impact on the community, and then we also included understanding about resources in New York City. And now I'll hand it over to Emma to talk about respect.
Great, thanks, Shubha. So as Shubha mentioned, one of the other main tenets of procedural justice is respect. It might sound very basic, but people want to feel as though the government body they're interacting with is treating them with respect. Maybe someone's had experiences where they haven't been treated with respect. So we wanted to be very careful that folks walk away from this having had a really great experience. So a few things went into making sure that happened. One is the language that we used. We wanted to be, very respectful, very clear, so that everyone understood what was happening. They understand what's expected of them. They understand what the goals are. And so that was a big part of it. And also our approach that we used. We really wanted to understand that, folks are coming in all different types of life circumstances. Again, they're speaking all types of languages. They have all types of educational backgrounds. We really want to be cognizant of that and make sure it's a great experience. So I'm going to go into the e-learning in a second, and I'll show you two pieces. The first is a pledge that we start out with to, again, just give them kind of the basics of how we're going to treat them and that we want them to feel respected. And then we'll go into an example of one of the video intros. So I'll switch over to the e-learning. So this, again, as I mentioned, is close to the beginning of the entire e-learning, and it shows our pledge to the user. So we pledge that we'll be honest and direct, we'll treat them with respect, we'll be fair and neutral, we'll provide them with an opportunity to participate, and we will treat all people equally. So again, that sort of sets the tone from the very beginning that that's what they should expect out of the e-learning. Then I'll show you another section. This is a video that's the intro to one of the charges that we talk about in more depth. And so each of these charges starts with a video that kind of gives a more personal example, right? So we want to make it feel relatable. Maybe it's a situation they have literally experienced with this summons, or just a situation they might be aware of. So I'll just play you this short video that kind of gives a more personal introduction to the charge we're about to talk about. So again, that's just one example. We kind of gave it, a bit of a personal flair, and we kind of gave an example that hopefully is pretty relatable to folks. So let me go back into our slides, and I will turn it back over to Shubha.
So voice in procedural justice is the idea that someone wants to be heard. Now, in e-learning, this was a little bit difficult to do. We might have thought of having someone type open answers, but we didn't have a keyboard for reasons of accessibility and language. Also, you wouldn't want them to type answers that don't go anywhere, because that's not really having a voice either. So what we decided to do was ask multiple choice questions throughout the module, and also just considered people's perspectives and got feedback from individuals who did the e-learning when we were designing it. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways that we do this in the e-learning now. So throughout the module, we would ask people questions like, do you have a better understanding now? And give them the opportunity to respond. Depending on their response, we would point them in the direction of being able to learn more information as well. So that was one example of how we did that. And near the end of the e-learning, we also give them the opportunity to give feedback. So we ask them a series of multiple choice questions that we then would use to understand whether the e-learning was effective as well. Those were some examples of voice. And now back to the slideshow, we'll hand it over to Emma.
All right. So one of the other tenets of procedural justice is the idea of being neutral or neutrality. And this really just means that everyone feels as though we're treating them the same, right? So it's neutral regardless of their background, of who they are, and really equal. So one way we do this is that the e-learning is offered to everyone who's eligible. If you're eligible, you can take it. There's no difference person to person. We also made sure that the e-learning itself is constant. So you take it on one day or you come back a few days later and take it, it would be the same. So the content itself remains neutral rather than changing day to day or in other ways. Also, the consequences of the violation would be the same. So again, if you get a summons for a particular violation, what the possible consequences are of, maybe community service or a fine or this e-learning would be the same, would be consistent. So I'll go into the e-learning in a moment to show an example of one of the charges that we kind of walk through in the e-learning. and where it shows you what the consequences of that would be. Okay. So this we'll see one of these sort of interactive games about one of the charges. And this one is about dog waste in a park. So in this one, we're sort of walking someone through, and really making it, bringing it to home. This is this person, they're running late for work. Maybe they don't clean up after their dog. So you run through this scenario, you sort of meet all the different neighbors that are affected. And you sort of see this day go forward. So I'll just show you a few slides of this. Again, you're meeting all these different people and you're seeing how it affects them, and sort of what the consequences are of not picking up after your dog. Let me show you the ending of this section, which is here where we get more information about, what happens if you get a summons for failure to remove dog waste. You can get a fine or community service. So again, this is really showing folks, here are the consequences of this type of summons and giving them more information about it. So now I'll jump back into the slide deck. And I will pass it back over to Shubha.
So as we launched the e-learning, we did get some feedback from users. So I'm going to walk out of here in a very good mood. That was really our intention with using a procedural justice mindset. And then certainly we increased people's understanding. I didn't know it was illegal to ride bikes in the park unless there are designated bike lanes. And I just learned something. I didn't realize other people besides police officers can write summons. And then very user-friendly without a doubt. We also got some feedback that was helpful for if we were doing this in the future, which we'll mention later as well. Certainly the slowness, which we explained was in fact by design, was something that, of course, people that were faster were finding that it was too slow. And then the cartoony nature of it, some people felt like they didn't like that, or they felt like it was condescending or disrespectful. And back to Emma.
Great. So this project was one example of how we can incorporate procedural justice into a technology project. Again, this another way that folks can access it, so they can use it from their homes, and again, really making it accessible to folks and using technology for that purpose of giving them a voice and all the other tenets we talked about. There are other instances where technology can sort of help with procedural justice. Text messaging for reminding folks about either a court date or an appointment with a practitioner, and being able to have a sort of back and forth text message conversation rather than just a one-way alert that goes out to that person. That's another way to give them a voice, to give them a space to say, hey, maybe I need directions, or I have issues with childcare and I might not be able to make my appointment, and to have it really be a mutual two-way conversation between a client and a practitioner. Another example is in courthouses, which can sometimes, feel intimidating. Maybe there could be, an interactive map that you could click to show it in different languages and kind of help guide you. So another way that someone could walk into a space that might feel intimidating or alien, and technology can be one of the tools to help them, feel like they do have a voice and they are being treated with respect. And back over to Shubha.
So we wanted to now get into really the details of what it took to make this happen. So planning was obviously a significant part of this. And we were in sort of this unique position where our mandate was just to offer a community service alternative to individuals who can't afford to pay a fine. We knew that we wanted something digital. We knew it had to last an hour. But that was it. Besides that, we were free to invent and imagine what we wanted. So we, in approaching the vendors, we, of course, had to ask ourselves 3 questions. who is it that's taking the e-learning? What demographic is it? What's our audience? When and how are they taking it? And where? That is really going to define what is possible and what makes sense. And why are they taking it? So figuring that out as well would help define what this e-learning would look like. And Emma, back to you.
Great. So for the who part of this, as Shubha mentioned, there's a lot to think about. What are the demographics of folks that might be taking it? What is their technical literacy? Are we making it as easy to use as possible for the widest variety of people? So there's a lot to consider. And a lot of these questions would help us to create what is often referred to as user personas, which is creating, a demographic. Here's an example of this person and what age might they be, what background might they have, and what do we know about them that might be taking this e-learning. Because we had such diverse users in terms of background, age, a lot of other factors, we really focused on their feelings and attitudes and emotions that they would come into this with. So we know folks might come in, they might be angry, they might be confused, they might be feeling anxious. And we really wanted to take that into account and make sure that they left feeling better than when they came in, ideally. So that was, one of the ways we really focused on it was, again, that emotional, response that someone might have from this. So again, in terms of, who it is, there's a lot of different backgrounds. We talked about different languages, different abilities, technical literacy. But again, we really tried to focus on, are they leaving? They feel like they have more information. They feel like they've been heard. Do they feel, maybe less annoyed than when they first started? And so that's one of the goals. As well as the knowledge about the criminal and civil justice process. Again, if they came in with a low level of knowledge, we would want them to leave with a higher level of knowledge once they've completed the e-learning. All right, and then back to Shubha.
So as we mentioned at the beginning, this project was sort of in two phases. Phase one was, new act, brand new idea, new partner agency. And so for this phase one, we collectively decided that they would do the e-learning when they came in person to OAK. And so they would be in person in the building, and there were some pros and cons, obviously. The cons are pretty obvious. Everyone has to come in person, which is not something that everybody can do. And it's quite time consuming and has to happen during sort of set hours of the day. The pros, though, are that, of course, it increased accessibility because everyone has to come in. They would have to have a hearing first, possibly, if they wanted to. But they would all do an intake with the intake coordinator. So the intake coordinator would be able to identify their tech needs, answer questions, and train them. They were also physically located near the intake coordinator. So if there was any confusion or inability to use it, they would have a person to be able to help them. And they would conclude with a check-in with the intake coordinator. So, this gives people that voice that we were talking about that's very important. It could enable them to ask questions that might have come up. So that was also very helpful. And then on a practical level, it also, and practical and cost level, it helped us because we didn't have to create something that was compatible on every browser. It didn't have to be mobile device compatible. We had total control over what computers they would be on, what browser they would be on, and what hardware they would have. So it was more cost effective and easier for us to support as we rolled out this brand new option. And back to Emma.
Great. So the when part for phase two, again, it's a little bit different. This would be after they would receive a summons, and they can do it at home or at a library, at a community center, on a friend's computer. So the when is a bit different. Again, they're not physically going to a space. They don't have that physical intake coordinator there, as Shubha was mentioning. But it does give them, that flexibility that they can do it kind of on their own schedule a bit. All right, back to Shubha.
So certainly there were lessons that we learned, things that we would probably approach differently next time that hopefully all of you can learn from. So one thing was around the accessibility and the sort of ADA accessibility considerations. So because in our phase one, we were basically like, look, they're gonna be in person, they're gonna be on a computer, there's gonna be a person, an intake coordinator to offer alternatives if the online learning doesn't work. We didn't make it completely ADA accessible. Once we had conversations about that, we realized that it's difficult or it's different to approach accessibility when you're talking about an interactive game. It's not as clear cut as with a website, for example, where the screen reader would read images and links. But with a game, you've got a lot of decision trees to make, and things are not sort of set up in this linear way. So, of course, we didn't pursue this very much, but so at the time we couldn't do this because it would be very expensive to basically recreate, this whole e-learning in a way that then would be accessible. So in the future, had we considered that from the very beginning, we could have thought of an interactive game that met all of our goals and would be accessible by everybody. Similarly, the game wasn't set up to be mobile friendly. And so in a similar way, once we got to phase two, it would have been very expensive to then try to create something that was mobile friendly. The way the game is, there's a lot of clicking, a lot of interaction, and a lot of things to read on the screen that don't lend themselves to a phone screen size. So it would have been quite costly to figure out how to make all of that mobile friendly. So another one where taking that into account at the beginning, even if at the beginning we thought that would never happen, would have helped us in phase two. And then lastly, as I mentioned, there were some people that felt like the sort of fun feeling, the cartoons were not as respectful. In fact, were sort of disrespectful. We had thought that, or what we were thinking that we were going for was, again, to sort of give a different feeling for this government interaction. But in retrospect, there would have been another way to make it fun and both respectful and not so playful and cartoonish, I think. So that would be another thing that in the future we would probably redo. And back to Emma.
All right. So there are things to consider, when moving something like this online. There are some pros. Some of these we've sort of touched on. The person doing it, if they're doing it from their living room, they don't have to commute into, a government office. There's also the fact that they can do it any time that works for them. They can do it around their work schedule, around their childcare schedule. Again, they're not confined within, the operating hours of an oath center. There are some cons. The support and compatibility, again, as mentioned before, if they were to go in, they would have an intake coordinator in the room. When they're doing it from their homes, they wouldn't have that person directly there. So of course, we try to make it as easy to use as possible. And there is, a help button they can click for more help, but it's not necessarily the same as having that person right there. As well as Shubha touched on, not every single browser is compatible with the e-learning. We did try to make it available in a wide variety of browsers, but it is possible that somebody would have to, download a new browser that they might not already have. So again, overall, we do think, it gives people a lot more options, but there are definitely pros and cons with having it, more self-directed, someone doing it from their home versus at, a more controlled center that has staff available. And again, as I mentioned, that loss of in-person benefits. So there's not someone right there able to assist you. All right, back to Shubha to talk about pricing.
So we e-learning, an online e-learning game can cost a really, really, really big range, from like several $1,000s to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it's really one of those things where, how big is a novel or how big is a story sort of thing. So some of the things that we found out through this work really impacts the price. The number of sort of interactive trees that you have. So, you've got a game, you're going along, the person has to make a decision. And based on the decision, how much does your story sort of branch out into sort of two different options? Or is it just that you make a decision and it's either like yes or no, and then you move on? So the more decision trees you have like that, the more expensive it's going to get. You can consider it almost like how many pages in a choose your own adventure book. The more pages, the more expensive you'll get. One that, as we talked before about the cartoons, one of the things that we found out was that actually to try to do photorealistic or photos is like the most expensive option. Still images that just sort of move around, which is what we have, would be relatively cheaper. And then, of course, full animation would be like a total video game would, of course, be very expensive. But yeah, with photos, you have to consider getting the photos or taking the photos, and then you have to consider different like emotional facial expressions for every photo. So you really have to do things like that a lot. The number of languages obviously increases cost because of translation. And we wanted to, and also had to have like a lot of languages. And then different types of languages, like the script going from left to right or right to left, and different characters can also add to the technical cost. And in our case, some of the scripts ended up like sort of not working in the layout. So that there was a cost there to test things and to fix them and figure out technically sort of what was happening. Obviously, sort of goes without saying, the length of the course really impacts the price. So 15 minutes versus 1 hour versus 2 hours is going to be different pricing. And then compatibility with how many browsers does it need to be tested on? Does it have to be mobile friendly? Is of course going to increase the price. So I think in our case, when we had the 1 hour one in the phase one, so it was sort of simple and a little bit more controlled, the range of cost in hours was 75 to 105K for that interactive learning. And so, just sort of going through some of these things, the level of animation, like I said, the languages, the length, and the compatibility for browsers, and then mobile friendly. Those are sort of the things that you would look at in terms of the pricing. And so that is pretty much our e-learning, the approach that we took, and then some of the nuts and bolts of what it took to implement our online learning. And we're excited that our phase 2 just launched this summer. So now people in New York City who get a civil summons are able to take a 1 hour or 2 hour online game online instead of paying their fine. And hopefully we'll learn something while they're at it.